It was meant to be just another polished summit, speeches, soundbites, and rehearsed applause echoing under the crystal chandeliers of the Capitol Grand Hall. The elite of conservative America packed every seat, basking in power, waiting for the next headline. President Trump had just wrapped his speech, all fire and fury, to a standing ovation that shook the walls. Cameras zoomed in. Flashes popped. The floor buzzed as Vice President J.D. Vance prepared to take the stage. But then, a voice cut through the crowd like a switchblade through silk. Uninvited. Sharp. Mike Pence. Former vice president. Now something colder. Angrier. And walking right up to the podium like he still owned it. "Let's stop pretending," Pence said, eyes gleaming, mouth curled in a smirk. J.D. Vance isn't a leader. He's Trump's obedient little puppet. Gasps. Actual gasps. One woman in pearls clutched her chest. A glass clinked and shattered somewhere in the back. Every senator, aide, and journalist froze mid-breath. Vance didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He just stood there, still as stone, unreadable as a cipher. Pence leaned in, smelling blood. "No spine, J.D., he sneered. "Just another hollow suit begging for crumbs from the king's table." A long, brutal silence. Even the Secret Service exchanged glances. Cameras locked in. Microphones tilted forward. And then, Vance moved. Not a step, a glide. His presence filled the room before his voice did. And when it came, it wasn't loud. It was cold. Clear. Deadly. He stared Pence down, not with rage, but something worse. "Pity." Mike, Vance said, voice calm as a blade being unsheathed. "If loyalty to a great man makes me a puppet, then what does that make you? A traitor with no strings? Or a servant to the people who hate everything you ever claimed to believe?" Boom. An audible loof from the crowd. Someone gasped. Someone laughed, quickly covered their mouth. A young staffer dropped his phone. Pence's smile cracked. Vance took a step closer. Still composed. Still coiled. "I stood by a president who stood by this country. You." He tilted his head. "You bolted the moment it got inconvenient. Straight into the arms of the same machine that tried to destroy us." The words landed like punches, each one heavier than the last. "You called me obedient?" Vance scoffed. "You obeyed fear. I obeyed truth. And unlike you, I never stabbed the American people in the back to save my own skin." Pence's mouth opened, then closed. Again. Nothing. A man drowning in a storm of his own making. The crowd shifted. Applause. First polite, then thunderous. Even Trump, watching from backstage, gave a slow, knowing nod. But Vance wasn't done. "Oh no. Not yet." He stepped forward, his voice now a soft but devastating thrum. "You want to talk loyalty, Mike? Where were you when cities burned in 2020? When lies ruled the airwaves and truth was treated like treason? You gave speeches. We gave blood." The cameras were rolling hard. The livestream counter blinked past 2.3 million. Pence turned away, lips tight. Tried to flee the fire. But Vance's final line pinned him to the floor. "You say I don't understand leadership?" He paused. Let the words hang like smoke. "You don't understand what it means to stand." And then silence. Not empty silence. Electric silence. A room transformed. A moment sealed. And somewhere, deep in the minds of every person watching, a single question took root. Was this the moment the balance shifted? The room was ice and fire. Pence stood frozen near the podium, shoulders stiff, a pale shadow of the man who had stormed in minutes earlier. His breath shallow. His eyes scanning the crowd, the sea of familiar faces suddenly cold, distant. And then J.D. Vance spoke. His tone wasn't angry. It was worse. It was surgical. "Leadership," Vance began, stepping into the center of the stage, voice clear and slow, "isn't about chasing applause or ducking blame. It's about standing tall when it costs you everything. Even when you're alone. Even when it hurts." A beat. The crowd held their breath. "You used to know that, Mike," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "Before you sold your name for a seat at the table of people who despise you." Pence's face drained, his smirk long gone. He looked hollow. And then came the strike, the one no one saw coming. "You were Trump's vice president," Vance said, voice sharp as a rifle crack. "Now you're the Democrats' errand boy. And history won't forget that." The room convulsed. Gasps. A stunned hush. People weren't just shocked now, they were wounded. Reporters huddled, mouths open. Senators exchanged glances, tight-lipped. One aide actually whispered, "Oh my God." Pence, motionless, looked like a man who had just realized the stage he walked onto was a minefield. Vance turned from him, slowly, deliberately, toward the sea of eyes, the rows of cameras. Then, to the people. "This isn't about me," he said, voice steady like a preacher at a funeral. "It's about truth. And the truth is, some men wear the title of vice president, but sell the soul of the office for a few dinner invites with the enemy. Oof. Someone in the back muttered it aloud. A few donors near the edge shifted uncomfortably. One of them turned his back on Pence. JD pressed on. No theatrics. Just brutal, surgical truth. You didn't just betray Trump, Mike. You betrayed every voter who believed you'd fight for them. Even when it was hard. Especially when it was hard. A woman in the third row, young, tear-streaked, started crying. She remembered the lockdowns. The layoffs. The silence from leaders like Pence. Vance's voice had cut past politics. It had hit marrow. This party isn't perfect, JD admitted, pacing now. But what we need isn't snakes and silk ties. We need fighters. And I won't let history be rewritten by the man who ran from the fight. The crowd erupted. Roars. Applause. Cheers that made the chandeliers tremble. And Pence? He looked like he'd aged a decade in 10 minutes. He tried to salvage something, anything. Took a shaky breath. His voice cracked. You think you know what it's like to sit where I sat, he said, tone brittle. You weren't there, JD. You don't know the pressure, the chaos. I do, Vance snapped, cutting in like a hammer through glass. And I stood firm. Silence. Again. The kind that leaves bruises. Pence pointed at him with a trembling finger, desperate now. You're a child in politics, he spat. You wrote on Trump's name. I built that legacy. You're just walking in shoes you didn't earn. JD's lips tightened. He waited. Then said, soft and lethal. The difference is, I never spat on the man who gave me the shoes. Boom. A low, stunned murmur swept the crowd like wind over dry leaves. Vance stepped closer. His voice was no longer just words, it was judgment. You act like you carried the burden. But when it mattered, when the country needed someone to finish the story, you handed the media the pen. A few heads nodded. One man in a battered veteran's cap stood up and clapped. Alone at first. Then more followed. Louder. Firmer. Vance didn't flinch. Leadership isn't avoiding pain. It's walking through it bleeding and still saying, I won't back down. Pence tried to smile. It collapsed halfway. He knew. He was losing the room. And then JD reached into his jacket. Slowly. Deliberately. He pulled out a thin black folder. Held it high. This, he said, turning so everyone could see, is a copy of communications between Mike Pence's office and multiple Democrat-led PCs dated weeks after January 6th. The crowd leaned in. One reporter shot to his feet, camera in hand. While he claimed to be praying for wisdom, Vance continued. He was already negotiating speaking fees. Gasps. Cries. Flashes. Pence's face went white. That's classified, he barked, voice cracking. Vance didn't even blink. Not anymore. The redacted version was cleared last night. I made sure of it. He walked to the podium. Laid the folder down like a judge passing sentence. This isn't revenge, Mike. It's revelation. And America deserves to know who you became once the cameras stopped rolling. Pence slumped. No rebuttal. No fire. Just silence. And in that silence, something broke. Even backstage, Trump turned to an aide and whispered. He just ended Pence's career. The truth didn't just land. It detonated. And as Pence stood there, small and silenced in the wreckage, one thing became clear. He hadn't insulted J.D. Vance. He had awakened him. When J.D. Vance placed that folder on the podium, the silence didn't just return, it transformed. It seeped into every row like a cold fog. People leaned in, whispering behind their hands, trying to make sense of what they'd just seen. Is that real? He worked with them? After everything they said about him? A ripple of disbelief traveled seat to seat. Vance stood motionless. No triumphant smile. No raised chin. He looked like a man carrying a weight too heavy to celebrate. The kind of weight that hurts even when you're right. Mike Pence backed away from the microphone, his face chalk white. His hand hovered near his jacket pocket, fiddling nervously with nothing. The room seemed to close in around him. The lights, once flattering, now scorched his face under the glare of shame. A few senators turned their heads, pretending to glance elsewhere. One aide covered her mouth. And in the third row, a local pastor who had flown in from Indiana simply lowered his gaze and whispered a silent prayer. JD's voice broke the silence. You said I was a puppet, Mike, he said, quietly but with an edge that cut. But puppets don't bring truth to light. Traitors keep it buried. An older woman in the front row, dressed in red, white, and blue, dabbed tears from her cheeks. Pence tried to speak, but when he did, his voice trembled like wet paper. This isn't how it was supposed to go. But Vance wasn't finished. He turned back to the audience, scanning their faces, wounded, stunned, betrayed. I didn't want this fight, he said, his voice steadier now. But we can't rebuild a nation by shielding the ones who undermined it from within. He didn't point. He didn't have to. The weight of his words found their target. While the Capitol burned with deception, you stayed quiet. While Americans begged for courage, you gave them statements. And when loyalty demanded action, you gave them a handshake and walked away. A young man, barely out of his 20s, stood near the back clutching a photo of a Marine in uniform. JD locked eyes with him. "That's your brother, isn't it?" The man nodded, voice caught in his throat. "He served while people like Mike Pence cut deals in backrooms. And that's why I'm done staying silent." The silence broke, slowly at first, then rising. Applause. Then cheers. The room stood in unison, the sound swelling until it filled every corner. Pence shrank back. His eyes darted toward the exit. But the storm wasn't over. Just as the applause began to die down, the back doors creaked open. Heads turned. Then bodies. Donald Trump entered the hall. He moved deliberately, not rushing, not speaking. Every eye followed him as he walked the aisle, chin lifted, unreadable. Pence froze in place. His shoulders stiffened. Vance stepped aside, giving Trump the podium without a word. He didn't look for approval. He didn't need it. Trump stood before the mic. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he looked at Vance and his voice rang out. "I've watched everything from backstage. And I've never been prouder of a vice president than I am right now." The audience erupted again. But Vance didn't smile. His jaw was tight. His eyes calm. He wasn't celebrating, he was anchoring. Trump turned to him, placed a firm hand on his shoulder. Loyalty doesn't mean blind obedience. It means standing for what's right even when it costs you. Then he turned, slowly, to Pence. "I gave you trust, Mike. And you didn't just break mine. You broke something much bigger." Pence's eyes flicked away. "You betrayed the people who believed in you. That's the part that'll follow you." And then Trump said it, the line that slammed through the room like a gavel. "You called JD a puppet. But today? He didn't pull your strings, he cut them." Shock rippled across the room. Some people clapped. Others just stared, stunned. A few cried. And just like that, the room no longer belonged to Pence. It belonged to Vance. The space, packed with press, leaders, and voters, was still. No coughing. No murmurs. No shifting feet. Every major network had cut their programming. The broadcast was live coast to coast. Twitter was in a frenzy. YouTube's live chat was flying too fast to read. Pence blinked again and again as if trying to wake up from a dream. But this wasn't a dream. And no one was cutting away. JD stepped back to the podium. Trump stood beside him, arms crossed, like a general at the end of a war. "America's not flawless," JD said. "We've stumbled. We've been misled. But nothing wounds deeper than being betrayed by someone who once stood at your side." He didn't so much as glance at Pence. And when a man chooses praise from his enemies over truth from his friends, he becomes smaller than his own shadow. From somewhere in the crowd, someone let out a quiet sob. The kind that comes from heartbreak, not just political, but personal. And as the cameras stayed rolling, the truth was no longer just spoken. It was seen. Pence's eyes flicked again toward the exit. So close. But he couldn't bring himself to move. His feet felt nailed to the floor. Not by force, but by failure. JD Vance lifted the folder once more, holding it like a mirror Pence couldn't look into. "This isn't a vendetta," he said quietly but firmly. "It's necessary. And it hurts. But how can a country begin to mend if the same hands that helped break her are still calling the shots?" The air was thick with grief. Applause faded into silence again, and through that silence, the sound of a wheelchair rolling forward broke the stillness. A teenage girl pushed her father gently down the aisle. Everyone watched. Vance saw them. He stopped speaking. "Sir," he said, voice respectful, "would you like to say something?" The man accepted the mic. His voice was rough, broken in, full of history. "I served under 3 presidents," he said. "Lost my leg to an IED outside Kandahar. But I never lost my faith, not in this country, not in its leaders. Not until Mike Pence turned his back on the man who had his." A stunned gasp moved through the crowd like wind across tall grass. The veteran turned slowly toward Pence. "You used to speak about duty. About principle. But when the rail storm came, you didn't stand tall. You folded." Pence looked down. Couldn't meet the man's gaze. Then the veteran turned to Vance. "You brought something back to this room. Something I hadn't felt in years. Integrity." Even Vance faltered for a moment. His eyes shimmered. The man's daughter touched his shoulder. "You've said enough, Dad," she whispered. JD took the mic back. His voice, now soft but resolute, filled the space again. "The people of this country aren't asking for superheroes. They're begging for someone to tell them the truth even when it's ugly. Across the front rows, heads lowered, many of them former allies of Pence. The energy in the room had shifted. This wasn't political anymore. This was personal, national, human. Mike Pence had built a career around staying composed. But now, beneath the weight of real accountability and a crowd that no longer applauded him, something inside cracked. I thought I was doing the right thing, he said, barely audible. I didn't mean for this to happen. Vance didn't lash out. He didn't need to. He interrupted gently with precision. Didn't mean to do what, Mike? Swap conviction for convenience. Betray those who put their faith in you for the sake of your image. Pence's voice quivered. I didn't think Trump could win again. I didn't want to go down with him. And there it was. The truth. JD stepped forward, calm, certain, unblinking. And that's exactly why you don't deserve this platform anymore. Pence looked fragile now. Not just politically, existentially. He turned toward Trump, desperate for something, support, forgiveness, maybe just acknowledgement. He got none. Trump stood still. His expression was stone. The crowd wasn't his anymore either. A few people stood backs turned to Pence in silent protest. No slogans. No chants. Just quiet rejection. Vance looked down at the microphone. No triumph in his face. Just grim clarity. Cowards run when it burns. But leaders? Leaders walk straight into the fire and they don't flinch. In that moment, Pence wasn't just exposed. He was undone. The illusion was over. The careful mask of decades had cracked in full view of the nation. Outside, news vans flooded the streets. Headlines blazed across every screen. Live, Pence crumbles under Vance's rebuke in unforgettable confrontation. Trump sides with Vance as conservative landscape shifts. Inside the hall, Vance now sat beside Trump, calm, composed, ready. Pence lingered at the edge, barely noticed. He had become a footnote to his own story. From the press gallery, a voice called out. Vice President Vance, should Pence be removed from the party? Vance raised his head. His voice was steady. Clear. This isn't about revenge. It's about responsibility. We talk so much about fighting the left, but what about the rot within? He let that hang. We don't just lose elections because of lies. We lose them because we reward betrayal as long as it's polite. He glanced at Pence, then back to the press corps. I'm not here to punish anyone. I'm here to protect something far more important. The truth. Because if we lose that, conservatism isn't just wounded. It's gone. Pence, now seated in the shadows, didn't move. And J.D. Vance? He wasn't rising anymore. He had arrived. Backstage, a staffer approached quietly and handed J.D. a small, folded letter. From your father, they whispered. Vance took it, nodding once. His expression unreadable. And somewhere far beyond that hall, a nation stared at their screens and realized they were watching not just the fall of a man, but the emergence of a new one. J.D. stepped out of the blinding lights and into a corridor wrapped in quiet. The roar of applause was gone now, muffled by thick walls and heavier thoughts. A staffer caught up to him, breathless. This came for you, sir. It's from your father. She placed the folded note in his hand, then vanished down the hallway. He stared at it a moment. Just paper. Ink. But when he opened it, his hands trembled like they were holding something sacred. Son. I watched every second. And for the first time in my life, I cried not out of pain, but out of pride. You didn't win today with force. You didn't roar. You didn't humiliate. You stood. Calm. Honest. And kind even when the truth burned. That's a kind of strength I never showed you. But today, you became the man I always wanted to be. You didn't tear Pence down. You simply let him meet the truth. And for that, I am proud beyond words. Dad. J.D. lowered the letter. His throat closed tight. The world, for a moment, went quiet. No podiums. No press. No titles. Just a boy inside a man hearing his father say, I'm proud when it mattered most. He folded the letter slowly, tucking it into his coat like a shield. For years, he had carried a battle for principles. For loyalty. For truth. But now it was personal. Now it was a mission for sons and fathers, for trust betrayed, and for a nation in need of repair. His phone buzzed. A private line. He answered with instinct. Vice President Vance speaking. A woman's voice spilled through, shaking. You don't know me, she said. My husband died in a house fire last year. He voted for Mike Pence twice. JD's heart dropped. I'm so sorry. He always believed in doing the right thing. But after today, I realized something. We've been waiting for someone to fight for us, not with noise, but with meaning. You did that. He leaned against the wall, his hand over his eyes. She continued. My husband used to say, true leaders don't walk ahead. They walk beside the people, especially when it's burning. Today, you walked with us. He couldn't speak. Only silence passed between them. "Please," she said softly. "Don't stop. We need you." JD exhaled, voice breaking. "I won't." He hung up. The hallway stretched before him, empty still. But something inside had changed. This wasn't about a fight. It was about a fracture in the nation finally being noticed. And maybe finally being healed. Back in the auditorium, lights brightened. Cameras resumed. The stage glowed. But something had shifted in the air. Mike Pence rose from his seat, slow and uncertain. His steps down the center aisle were quiet, ghost-like. No applause. No smiles. Not even a nod from those who once called him friend. Eyes turned away. Back stiffened. He reached the doors and paused. Waiting. Hoping. For acknowledgement. For a whisper of redemption. But the room gave him only silence. He stepped into the cold outside world alone. No reporters followed. No flashbulbs chased him. Only the sharp sound of his shoes fading against the stone and the heavy thud of the door closing behind him. Inside, the stage belonged to someone else now. J.D. Vance walked through the crowd slowly, not as a victor, but as someone returning something lost. Dignity. Truth. He greeted people. Listened. Held hands. Near the aisle, a man in a worn military jacket stood with a cane. His chest bore the weight of wars, not just medals, but memories. When J.D. reached him, the old veteran didn't speak right away. He just looked into J.D.'s eyes. Then offered his hand. "It's been a long time since I believed in a man behind a podium," he said, voice graveled by age. "But today you spoke like someone who remembered us. All of us." J.D. grasped his hand, firm and steady. "You deserve to be remembered." The veteran nodded. "Just promise me this," he said, turning slowly. "Don't let this place hollow you out like it did the others." Vance stood still, heart-thudding. He watched as the man limped away, slow, deliberate steps carrying the weight of everything he'd seen. Across the hall, people were crying. Not from fear, but from something cleaner. Relief. A mother held her toddler in her arms and leaned close, whispering gently, "That's our vice president." And for the first time that day, J.D. Vance smiled softly, humbly. Not for cameras. Not for legacy. But for the promise he had just made. To never become the man who left. To never stop standing in the fire. The cheers had faded. The cameras had turned away. But the weight? It hadn't left. Backstage, J.D. Vance found a quiet corner and sank into a metal folding chair. His suit was wrinkled. His hands still trembled slightly from the adrenaline. He stared at the floor like it held all the questions no one had asked him yet. Footsteps echoed softly. President Trump entered without a word, holding 2 bottles of water. He passed one to J.D., then lowered himself into the chair beside him, knees creaking. They sat in silence. Finally, Trump spoke, voice more gravel than usual. "You didn't just stand up there today. You stood between the people and the abyss." J.D. didn't respond right away. He turned the water bottle in his hands. "I didn't do anything heroic," he said quietly. "I just refused to lie." Trump gave a crooked smile. "That's the rarest kind of courage in this town." There was a pause. A long one. Then Trump leaned closer, more serious now. "They're with you now. But don't let the spotlight melt the man who stood in the dark." J.D. looked at him. "I didn't come here to be admired. I came here to make sure the forgotten don't stay forgotten." Trump nodded once, firm. "That's why you'll outlast every one of them." And then he was gone, his footsteps fading into the hallway like the closing of a book. J.D. sat a while longer, alone with his thoughts. And with what came next. Later, he climbed into the back seat of a waiting SUV. The city drifted by in amber light and blurred shapes, monuments in shadow, streets nearly empty. His chief of staff turned in the front seat. "The media's going wild. Every outlet. Do you want the rundown?" J.D. shook his head. "No. Not tonight." Instead, he reached into his jacket and unfolded the worn letter from his father. He didn't read it. He just held it. It was enough. The driver glanced up. "You did something tonight, sir. Something people won't forget." J.D. looked out the window at the glowing silhouette of the Lincoln Memorial, still and eternal. "I'm not here to be remembered," he murmured. "I'm here to help them remember who they've always been." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a torn scrap of paper. For words faded with time. "Tell the truth always." His mother's voice echoed in his memory, calm, firm, unshakable. He tucked the note back into his coat like it was armor. By the time midnight rolled past, J.D.'s phone had filled with messages not from strategists or donors, but from Americans with calloused hands and cracked hearts. Farmers, firefighters, factory workers, teachers, widows. Some were long. Others were barely a sentence. "You said what we couldn't. I watched with my son. We cried. You gave me back something I'd lost, belief. But one message lingered. Mr. Vance, I'm 17. My dad lost everything last year. I didn't care about politics until tonight. Now I do. Because you made us feel seen. Please don't change. He read it again. Then again. He whispered it aloud to no one. You made us feel seen. His staff sat around him in silence. No one moved. No one needed to. He looked at them, his voice low. This isn't about winning seats anymore. It's about restoring people's sense of worth. Their voice. Their fire. Some nodded. Others just blinked hard. Because they knew what happened today was no longer politics. It was personal. It was real. At 1:41 a.m., with the city fast asleep and the spin machines quiet, JD walked alone into a small chapel in the residence. No speeches. No notes. No press. He sat on the cold wood bench and lit a candle. The flame danced quietly, fragile but steady. He folded his hands, bowed his head, and whispered, "Don't give me more than I can carry. Help me stay clean when the dirt rises. And if I lose my way, take it from me before I forget why I ever cared." No response. No miracle. Just stillness. And peace. Then the door eased open. President Trump stepped in, coat over his pajamas, slippers quiet on the stone. "Figured you'd be in here." JD looked up, a faint smile. "Couldn't sleep." Trump sat beside him, gazing up at the cross. "You think the country's ready?" JD didn't hesitate. "I think they're exhausted from pretending everything's fine." Trump stood, stretched. "Then let's stop pretending." He placed a hand on JD's shoulder. "Let's remind them what real looks like." And together they walked out, not toward the stage, but toward something deeper than power. Toward purpose. And in the quiet behind them, the candle still flickered. Still burning. Just like the country they were about to fight for, broken, yes, but not beyond redemption. By dawn, America had already made its coffee and turned up the volume. Inside a glass-walled studio high above Pennsylvania Avenue, J.D. Vance sat opposite Barbara King, the country's most formidable political interviewer, sharp, poised, eyes like razors behind soft lighting. The nation was tuned in. "Vice President Vance," Barbara began, folding her fingers. "What was your first reaction when Mike Pence accused you of being a puppet on live television?" J.D. didn't flinch. His tone was steady. His hands still. "I felt disappointed." Barbara blinked. "Not angry." "No," he said gently. "It's hard to be angry at a man who's lost his way." She leaned forward, her voice dropping. "You said something that stopped him cold. Millions watched. Can you repeat it?" JD paused, then met the camera, not with fire, but with purpose. "I told him, you called me a puppet for standing beside President Trump. But you traded your integrity for applause from people who would never sit at your table unless it was to dismantle it." There was a silence in the studio so deep you could hear a pen click in the control room. On the internet, hashtags ignited. Hashtag Vance speaks. Hashtag the last honest man. Hashtag not your puppet. Barbara sat back, visibly moved. "Some say you may have just reshaped the conservative identity." JD gave a soft smile. "I didn't reshape anything. I just reminded people what it used to mean. When the cameras cut, the world didn't. Something seismic had shifted and people felt it." Later that evening, Vance returned home for a few hours, just enough time to hold the world that still grounded him. His son was already under blankets, his eyes flickering beneath a night light shaped like the moon. As JD sat beside him, the boy spoke softly. "Daddy, why did the man on TV say you were bad?" JD froze. He'd stood before roaring crowds, hostile reporters, and unblinking cameras. But this question? It hit deeper than all of them. "Because, buddy," he said quietly, "when you stand up for what's right, some people feel threatened. So they try to make you look small." The boy looked puzzled. "But you didn't yell. Or get mean." JD smiled at him. "Because strength isn't loud. It's honest." His son reached out, wrapped his arms around him. "You're my hero." Vance swallowed hard. "No. You're the reason I keep standing." He kissed his son's head and walked to the doorway. The silence of the room was sacred. He knew he had to go back. Into the storm. Into the fight. But now he remembered exactly who he was doing it for. Across town. In a bland hotel room that smelled of air conditioning and regret, Mike Pence sat in darkness. The television glowed blue, replaying clips of JD's interview. But the sound was off. He didn't need the audio. He knew what had been said. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the remote, but stopped when his own image from years ago appeared on screen. Him and Trump side by side, smiling, believed. Now Pence looked into the mirror. and didn't recognize the man staring back. He picked up his phone, dialed a familiar number, an old advisor, someone from before the fall. The voice answered bluntly, "You're done, Mike." Silence. They've moved on. They didn't want silence. They wanted someone who'd bleed for them. Click. Pence lowered the phone, placed it on the nightstand, and turned out the lights. But darkness didn't comfort him. It just reminded him of what he'd abandoned. In a small-town middle school in southern Ohio, a civics class had just finished watching clips of the debate. Their teacher, Mrs. Langston, stood at the front of the classroom, arms crossed, expression soft but intense. "All right," she said. "What did you take away from what we watched?" For a moment, silence. Then a shy voice from the back. "He didn't sound like the others. He didn't talk down to us." Another student raised a hand. A boy with work boots already on, heading to help his dad after school. It felt like he was just telling the truth, not selling it. Mrs. Langston nodded, her throat tight. "Leadership," she said, "isn't about being perfect. It's about being real. It's about speaking when it's easier to stay quiet." On the class screen, JD's voice echoed again. "Cowards run from fire. Leaders walk through it." A student whispered, "I wish my uncle could have heard that before he gave up." No one replied, but the room felt heavier and more awake. For them, J.D. Vance wasn't a politician. He was proof that maybe someone finally understood. Back at the Capitol, Jessica knocked softly on the vice president's office door. "Come in," J.D. called. She entered, eyes rimmed with red, holding a file she hadn't opened. She sat across from him, her voice uneven. "There's something I need to say." He looked up, patient. "Say it." "I used to believe in Mike Pence. Defended him. Wrote op-eds. Spoke at fundraisers. Even after he turned away from Trump, I made excuses. I told myself it was strategy. Survival." She paused. "But today, you reminded me why I ever believed in any of it to begin with." JD said nothing, just offered a soft nod. "Thank you," she whispered. He picked up his coffee, eyes locked with hers. "Then let's not waste it." Outside, the city moved as it always had. Cars honked. Lights blinked. But inside that room, something else had begun. Not a campaign. Not a show. A reckoning. A revival. A fire finally catching. And for the first time in a long time, people weren't looking to be saved. They were looking to stand. Jessica stood in the doorway for a long time before speaking. When she finally did, her voice was quiet, honest, fraying at the edges. "Yesterday, something changed in me." JD looked up from his desk. "Go on." She stepped into the office, not as an aide but as someone carrying the weight of disappointment. In herself, in her choices, in the silence she once defended. "When I first came here, I thought I was fighting for something real. Somewhere along the way, I stopped asking what that something was. I told myself it was about duty, loyalty. But really, I was just afraid of being wrong." She blinked, trying to stay composed. "But watching you yesterday, I remembered what it felt like to believe again. Not in a candidate, not in a party, but in the idea that politics can still help people." JD walked to her, no script, no pose. "We've all been loyal to the wrong people. What matters is what we do once we know it." Her eyes shimmered. "You didn't just take a stand. You reminded us what we came here for." He gave her a soft nod. "Then it was worth it." Outside, more staff had gathered, no schedule, no agenda. Just presence. No one said a word. They didn't have to. Later that night, JD entered the Oval Office under low lights and heavy quiet. President Trump stood near the tall windows, silhouetted against the south lawn. He didn't turn when JD came in. "You know," Trump said softly, "I thought I'd seen every kind of political speech." He turned slowly, and for once, his face carried something unspoken, grief, maybe grace. "But what you did yesterday, that wasn't political. It was redemptive." JD didn't know what to say. He simply stood still, listening. "You reminded me what this whole thing was supposed to be. Not about dominance or optics. About people. Forgotten ones. The ones who still love this country but stopped believing anyone loved them back. He took a step closer. You didn't win them with slogans. You earned them with truth. And they're yours now. Then something unexpected. Trump pulled JD into a brief, tight embrace. And for the first time in a long time, the Oval Office didn't feel like a political arena. It felt like something closer to a promise renewed. The next morning, JD arrived to find a small envelope on his desk. No official seal. No return address. Just a name in shaky handwriting. Joseph P. Age 11, Nebraska. He opened it. The words were simple. Uneven. Honest. Dear Mr. Vance, my dad used to believe in Mike Pence. He had his sign in the yard. But after Pence turned on Trump, my dad got quiet. We stopped talking about America. Then yesterday he cried watching you speak. I only saw him cry once when our dog died. He said, that man remembers us. Thank you for being brave when it was hard. You're not a puppet. You're someone who didn't forget. From Joseph. JD folded the letter, pressed it to his chest. No applause. No spotlight. Just the stillness of a small boy's voice telling the truth the country needed to hear. And that's why he would keep going. In Indiana, Mike Pence sat alone in a booth at a roadside diner, the kind with chipped mugs and quiet jukeboxes. The waitress refilled his coffee without a word. A couple walked in, caught his eye, and looked away. His plate sat untouched. His phone buzzed once, then stopped. No more requests. No interviews. No stage. He reached into his coat and pulled out an old photo, him and Trump on the 2016 trail, hands raised, hopeful. Now it felt like a ghost of another man. A version of himself he no longer recognized. He whispered aloud as if confessing to the walls. I misread him. I misread all of it. But it didn't matter now. The story had already moved on. That evening, under golden chandeliers and national silence, President Trump stepped up to a podium flanked by flags. Standing beside him, not behind, was J.D. Vance. Yesterday, Trump said, wasn't just a moment. It was a turning point. And it was led by a man who didn't look for applause, he looked for the truth. He turned, nodded to J.D., and stepped aside. Vance approached. He glanced at the teleprompter. Then reached over and switched it off. I don't need lines someone else wrote. He looked out across the room, his voice low and clear. People are tired of theater. Tired of pretense. Tired of watching their country get handed off to anyone who'll play the part. He took a breath. If standing next to a president who refused to abandon his country makes me a puppet, then I'll wear that title with pride. Because I'd rather be tethered to truth than admired for saying nothing. The room rose to its feet. But this time it wasn't political. It was personal. Across the country, in homes and barns, schools and truck stops, people saw something they hadn't in years. Not a performance. Not a savior. Just a man who still believed in the people who were told to give up hope. And this time, they believed back.